Louisiana, a land rich in history and resources. Originally the home of the Natchez, the Homer, and the Choctaw, but the adopted home of Iberville, Bienville, and Tonti. Louisiana, the focus of international struggle and intrigue for centuries, a place of mystique, the home of a people known for distinct culture and institutions, the parish and police jury. Louisiana, that catalyst for transforming the former British North American colonies into a national melting pot. Louisiana, the birthplace of jazz, the refinement of blues and the gospel, the source of Creole and Cajun food, the home of Huey Long and Evangeline, Lee Armstrong and Marie Laveau. The Louisiana Purchase, arguably the world's most significant real estate transaction, will be the subject of this semester-long series, both on its immediate importance but its continuing impact today. Welcome to week 11 in our continuing series on Louisiana Purchase. Dr. Donald E. DeVore, Dean of the Eastern Division and Wheaton College of Southern University at New Orleans, is the lecturer. Dr. DeVore also was a member of the History Department of LSU, where he was honored for outstanding teaching. Previously, he served as Executive Director of the Amherst Research Center. DeVore co-authored, along with the late Joseph Larkson, Crescent City Schools, an in-depth study of public education in New Orleans from 1841 to 1991. His lecture will focus on early educational efforts in Louisiana, particularly the slow progress to create a public school system in the state where in the past education had been almost the exclusive domain of the Catholic Church. DeVore reviews early colonial educational efforts as well as the initial attempts to form a public education system by offering state support to existing private schools.
Adrian Parker, who designed New Orleans, did not provide provisions for a school in the plans for the city. Nonetheless, under the leadership of Father Raphael, the Capuchin Superior in New Orleans, a school for boys opened in April 1725 on St. Anne Street, Father Raphael School. Attendance was small and the curriculum consisted of reading and writing. Some students, however, studied Latin. A few Native Americans attended, and Father Raphael made plans to admit more. Father Raphael School is considered the first school in Louisiana. At times, up to 3 individuals taught at the school in the early years. That initial educational effort eventually failed because of insufficient support. By 1740, Capuchin fathers indicated the school had fallen into ruin, and plans to revive a school for boys did not materialize. 2 years after the start of Father Raphael School, the Ursuline nuns arrived in New Orleans to operate and staff a hospital and school for girls. They first occupied Bienville's house. Their first school was built in that area. The education that the students received was consistent with educational thinking that existed in early 18th century France. The Ursulines taught commuters and boarders. The curriculum consisted of catechism, reading, writing, French, geography, arithmetic, history, music, sewing, needlework, and housework. The Ursuline nuns provided some instruction to African Americans and Indians. They attended for 90 minutes in the afternoon. The Ursuline nuns and their school moved to a permanent home in July 1734. Education was a means to an end for the Ursuline nuns, and that end was to know, love, and serve God. So religious instruction remained the cornerstone of their curriculum, but reading, writing, and crafts training, such as knitting and sewing, were important as well. 3 other features were important: the use of student assistants, the fostering of community, and the promotion of competition. The Ursuline School remained in operation despite considerable difficulty. Again, the main problem was financial. The Ursuline nuns had more success in their educational efforts than the Jesuits and French officials in Louisiana who championed the creation of a college to be located in New Orleans. Those who supported the creation of a college argued that education produced better citizens and the lack of education opportunities retarded the colony's growth because children sent from the colony to France for education often chose to remain. The official French response remained the same. The colony's stage of development did not warrant the establishment of a college. The refusal of French and Company of the Indies officials to support educational efforts in Louisiana stifled but did not prevent some educational advances. Private schools helped fill some of the void. These private schools were not affiliated with the Catholic Church. Students paid a tuition to attend. Even more so than today, the majority of the population in French colonial Louisiana could not afford to send their children to private school. For those who could, however, their children often received a good education. Tutorial instructions provided another means of education. Indeed, several scholars have suggested that private tutors accounted for a significant amount of the instruction students received during the colonial period. Often, the student-tutor relationship was defined by a contract enforceable by colonial officials. The use of tutors, like attendance at private schools, entailed a cost. A system of education that enjoyed wide support and use, and little or no direct cost, was the apprentice system. In a sense, the apprentice system was a tutorial system for crafts. Individuals received instruction in a variety of trades: carpenter, mason, shoemaker, tailor, barber, roofer, locksmith, and goldsmith. In theory, design, and intent, the apprentice system was an excellent arrangement to transfer knowledge and sometimes included instruction in reading and writing as well as the trades. More so than the written agreements that governed many tutor-student relationships, apprenticeship contracts contain specific terms outlining duties, responsibilities, and expectations. The duration of the apprenticeship period varied, but most contracts were for 3, 4, or 5 years. At the end of the French control in Louisiana in the 1760s, to the degree a system of education had advanced in the province, it had occurred in New Orleans. The sparse population and the difficulty of travel rather than a lack of interest in education accounted for part of it. With that point made, tutor-student and apprentice education and knowledge transfer did operate to a limited degree outside New Orleans, and some residents sent their children to New Orleans to attend the Ursuline School and, during this brief period of existence, for the Raphael School. Another mode of knowledge transfer was household education. Parents or older siblings, for example, provided instructions in reading, writing, religion, and crafts. To be sure, this type of instruction was not comparable to that found in private schools or through the use of professional tutors. But those individuals living at the margins of 18th century French colonial society, or those with the financial means to properly educate their children, but unable to do so because of distance, household education was better than no attempts to educate their children. By the time Spain assumed control of Louisiana, that Catholic nation had a well-established educational policy and system in the Americas. Like the practice in Spain, the church was involved in education in the Spanish colonies. The Jesuit order was active, founding and operating primary and grammar schools. The Spanish government sponsored schools and private schools existed as well. Indeed, Spanish colonial law required the establishment and operation of a primary school in each town. The law, however, often went unheeded and unenforced. Such also was the fate of a law that required the maintenance of a school for Native Americans. Despite having an educational system, a model, if you will, in place that could be replicated in Louisiana, the Spanish continued the policy of educational neglect that they inherited from the French. They did so, however, for different reasons. The French had refused to pursue a vigorous education expansion policy because they believed Louisiana had not reached a state of economic or population development to justify the expenses required to support a viable educational system. On the other hand, Spanish officials looked at the same set of circumstances and concluded that too much development had occurred, the development of institutions of French origins and identity, leading them to believe that it would be impossible to institute their educational system until the former French citizen had achieved some assimilation into Spanish ideas, customs, and beliefs. Transforming French Louisianians into loyal Spanish subjects was a difficult task indeed. Resistance to Spanish control and influence rather than attempts at assimilation was the norm. Spanish officials tried and achieved some success. Education emerged as an important component of their strategy to win the allegiance of their new subjects. The effort to use state-supported schools to thaw the cold feelings of the French to their new sovereign began with Governor Don Luis de Gonzaga in July 1771. Governor Gonzaga received a letter from the Minister of the Indies indicating the king's intent to establish schools in Louisiana to provide religious instructions as well as primary and grammar instruction. A contract outlining the educational plan accompanied the letter. The contract indicated that 3 teachers and a director would take charge of the school. The director did not teach, had charge of the library, supervised the teachers, developed teaching methods, and provided for the overall administration of the school. The teachers were each assigned specific subjects. One of the main subjects, of course, was the Spanish language. All 3 teachers taught that subject. In fact, the bulk of the initial instruction students were scheduled to receive in the school consisted of Spanish language and religious studies. The educational aim for the king and Spanish officials was ultimately to produce and foster Spanish nationalism. This understanding was not lost on the erstwhile French subjects. For most of them, learning the Spanish language and embracing Spanish culture was too high a price to pay for the opportunity to obtain literacy. That did not prevent the teachers and the directors from trying. A retrospective assessment by Governor Miro in April 1788 details some of the problems the school and educational leaders had encountered. Miro maintained that Governor Gonzaga found himself greatly embarrassed as to the establishment of these schools, because he knew that the parents would not send their children to them unless they were driven to it by the fear of some penalty. Although, as we know, 18th century Spaniards were not adverse to using penalty to obtain compliance, Miro's predecessors refrained from adopting a policy of forced education. Instead, as Miro summarized, Governor Gonzaga, quote, confined himself to making the public acquainted with the benefits they would derive from the education with the magnanimous heart of His Majesty there put within their reach, end quote. Undoubtedly, the French population just did not get it, for Miro's lament that no pupil ever presented himself for the Latin class. A few came to be taught reading and writing only. In a still later analysis of the state of education in Louisiana, Governor Carondelet went beyond the aversion to Spanish culture and nationalism thesis. In Carondelet's view, the educational effort had been hampered by, quote, the liberty and freedom in which the youth of the colony were reared, the poverty of the colonists who needed assistance of their sons, and the custom of early marriages, end quote. The failure of the former French citizens to embrace the public educational program of Spanish officials spurred the development of alternate educational systems, private schools, apprenticeship, tutorial arrangements, and the Ursuline School. These alternate systems reflected and depended on individual and group initiative. Few who participated in these systems aspired to enter government service or one of the 3 professions of law, medicine, or theology. Most of them desired a craft and functional literacy. The Ursuline School continued during the Spanish period and even enjoyed the support of Spanish officials, despite the continued use of the French language. The curriculum at the school retained its religious, craft, and familial orientation. The Ursuline nuns helped to diffuse French language, culture, and values among the Spanish settlers and officials. In other words, the French population forced the Spanish to accommodate their language and culture more than Spanish officials, clergy, and settlers were able to impose their culture on them. Given time, it would have occurred. Time, from the vantage point of the 1780s and 1790s, was something Spanish officials thought they had. And remember, despite setbacks and territory losses, the Spanish had been in the Americas for 3 centuries. We should properly excuse them for their optimism, for nations, like individuals, are better at looking back than forward. We now know, of course, the time to diffuse Spanish language and culture in Louisiana was something the Spanish did not have. Louisiana again became a prize, concession, or pawn in European politics, and in less than 10 years went from Spanish to French to American control. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Louisiana residents became part of a nation with definite views on education. As colonial Louisiana had contended with establishing and maintaining a viable education policy, its neighbors to the east were developing some definite ideas regarding education. Education in the English American colonies embraced and placed an importance on education in the service of God, just like the emphasis that existed in French and Spanish Louisiana. But colonial English Americans had added considerably to that idea. By the time of the American takeover of Louisiana, Americans and their leaders shared an expanded view of the purpose and importance of education. Republicanism, civic virtue, and social and economic mobility depended on education and an accessible education system. The Virginia colony experienced a transformation from a colony of adventurers to an ordered society. Education was involved in this process. During Virginia's first phase, education was in the hands of ministers. They used it both as an instrument to promote discipline and order among the colonists and as a device for winning the loyalty of the Native Americans. In Virginia, the interests of the settlers changed from efforts to extract gold to the production of staples such as grains, grapes, silk, grass, and tobacco. The change influenced efforts to establish free public schools in Virginia to educate and instruct children in religion, civility, and civic duty. The early effort to start a school system failed, but the intent and focus were important. English settlement featured attempts to obtain and maintain self-sufficient agriculture and trading communities, involved families and the creation of England-type institutions such as schools. Farther north, the separatists and Puritans also pursued the development of stable communities. In addition to the family and church, schools and universities would be used to shape individual character. By 1660, Massachusetts Bay had enacted legislation that required families to teach their children to read and understand the principles of religion and the laws of the colony. Each church had to have a pastor and teacher. Towns of 50 households had to appoint teachers of reading and writing, and towns of 100 households were required to establish grammar schools. During the 17th century, advances in printing technology made books, information, and knowledge more accessible, and Europeans, especially the English, took advantage of the increased access to books, including the lower ranks of society. Books that Europeans brought with them to the English colonies in the 17th century consisted of Bibles, religious books, ancient and Christian classics, manuals of law, medicine, politics, surveying, agriculture, and conduct. Some books were of poetry, drama, history, and fiction. John Locke's educational beliefs influenced individuals on both sides of the Atlantic. In his thoughts concerning education, he maintained there were 4 goals to education: virtue, wisdom, breeding, and learning. In thoughts, he suggested a curriculum that focused on learning to read and write in native languages, introduction to arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and exposure to aspects of history. He also suggested instructions in ethics, law, logic, rhetoric, and natural philosophy. Locke favored instruction in dancing, music, fencing, horsemanship, and manual arts such as gardening, metalwork, or bookkeeping. Finally, he recommended travel. Locke had a utilitarian view of education and could see that men were endowed by their nature but largely shaped by education. Locke believed the ultimate business of learning is not mastery of a particular science, or indeed of all the sciences, but rather the development of the capacities that enable a man to attain any part of knowledge he shall apply himself to or stand in need of the future course of his life. Lockean views on learning disseminated through popular English serials such as The Tatler, The Spectator, and The Gardener. His views also disseminated in the colonies by the works of James Berg and Isaac Watts. Even more important than Berg or Watts to the development of an educational ideology was Benjamin Franklin. Many colonists became familiar with Franklin's ideas on education through his writings. Quote, "Diligence is the mother of good luck," close quote, according to Poor Richard in Franklin's Almanac. He also stated, "Diligence became, after inheritance, the leading way to wealth, status, and power, and hence truly the parent of fortune." Education was seen as a key to advancement in the arts, professions, trades, and business. The doors of wisdom are never shut, evidence of a continuous belief and a commitment to continuing education. In the 18th century, many colonists were exposed to didactic literature, and by 1763, each colony had at least one press, and a total of 40 existed in the colony. Presses produced an increasing number of newspapers, almanacs, magazines, textbooks, manuals, sermons, legal codes, and pamphlets. The keepers of the presses, printers, were a fascinating group involved in entrepreneurial activity, public affairs, and cultural leadership. In particular, the printers, quote, almanacs, newspapers, and magazines on the one hand, and their manuals and textbooks on the other, were deliberately designed to teach and readily available to those desirous of learning. Other trends developed in the English colonies that would affect education in Louisiana after the purchase. Libraries increased in both number and holdings. Different types of libraries included college libraries, public libraries, and private subscription libraries. Benjamin Franklin and others started a subscription library named the Library Company. 50 original members existed. The Library Company idea spread throughout the colonies and provided an instrument of education in 18th century America. Education for a fee increased in the 18th century. Those who favored a fee system viewed it as faster and more economical than an apprentice system. Scholarly clubs or learned societies represented another means of education. Members read and discussed topics and original essays. By the time of the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, colonial educational practice enabled John Adams to form his argument as opposition to Britain's attempt to reverse or take away the march of progress to freedom and enlightenment exemplified by English settlement in America and colonial culture and values. The importance of the press and literature contributed to the American Revolution. Revolutionary literature propagandized and instructed, and increased interest in political affairs. Personal publication increased political literacy and technical literacy. An increase in the number of writers led to increased competition, fostering greater variety in presentation, reasoned political arguments, satirical essays, inflammatory editorials, provocative engravings, inspirational poems, and patriotic songs. Increased publication around the political issues with Britain supported appreciation for literacy and education. Self-instruction, self-education was important. John Adams attended Harvard, but his serious political studies started after college. Thomas Jefferson attended William and Mary College, but began his serious political readings after leaving college. And history began to replace theology as the first subject of study. Colonists read history for guidance in affairs, not for diversion. The extent of schooling in colonial America around 1770 consisted of three general types of institutions: English Common School, Latin Grammar School, and the Academy. English Common Schools stressed reading, writing, and arithmetic. Grammar schools included classical languages and literature. The Academy included instructional components of the English Common and Latin Grammar, and even college-type courses. Schools, however, remained ungraded. By 1775, 9 colleges existed with charters to grant degrees. By 1783, 13 colleges with charters to grant degrees operated in the former colonies. After a successful break with Britain, leaders in the new nation continued their commitment to education in schools. They saw education as important to economic growth and social mobility. Denominations used schools as agencies of missionary endeavor. Increased participation in public affairs contributed to increased consumption of published materials and increased demand for literacy. Despite general American consensus about the need for education, disagreements existed about the means. Despite the disagreements, a degree of consensus developed during the early decades of the 19th century concerning what a broad public education in the arts of self-government might become. Education policy would feature 3 main components: schools to produce literacy and a certain common core of knowledge, morality, and patriotism, a free press to disseminate multiple views on important public issues to foster and enlighten public opinion, and voluntary associations such as civic organizations and political parties. Early national leaders believed Americans needed a minimum core of shared knowledge and values essential to the functioning of popular government. Leaders like Benjamin Rush wanted a national university and believed it absolutely necessary that knowledge of every kind should be disseminated through every part of the United States. Adam Smith, in his The Wealth of Nations, discussed education. Smith supported popular education even for the poor or working class, supported state funding for education if for no other reason than successful democracy depended on support and participation from a literate and informed citizenry. The Wealth of Nations underwent a change in America after the first translation and summaries. Daniel Raymond wrote Thoughts on Political Economy and criticized Adam Smith for only including private wealth in his analysis of a nation's wealth. According to Raymond, a nation's wealth included both private wealth and public wealth included natural resources, the extent of commerce and trade, development of arts and sciences, and the resourcefulness and diligence of its people. Raymond did not discuss methods to nurture or develop advances in arts and sciences or the people's resourcefulness. Others took his ideas and used them to fashion a policy of public education. Education became important not only to support civic virtue and republicanism, but individual economic development as well. It became a commonplace to recognize the economic advantages of the cultivation and diffusion of knowledge. It was within this educational context that the next phase of Louisiana educational odyssey unfolded. Perhaps nowhere did public education face greater obstacles than in Louisiana. Its colonial past left it with none of the common town schools that existed in New England, for example. Nor did Louisiana's colonial past engender such democratic visions as those of Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. Without such historical foundation, Louisiana educational leaders had to import an educational plan from the outside and then put it into place, often in the face of opposition from local citizens who were deeply attached to the city's elitist colonial traditions. Indeed, Louisiana was the young republic's first experiment with trying to impose its institutions, not only of education, but also of language and democratic government, upon an essentially foreign society. The tension between the host population of Louisiana natives and the American newcomers plagued public education in this state for much of the 19th century. After the United States purchased Louisiana in 1803, American officials attempted to transfer American scheme of education to Louisiana. President Thomas Jefferson's assessment of the state of education in Louisiana at the time of the purchase, however, was bleak. He believed 50% or less of the population could read and write, and only 200 could do it well. Consistent with Jefferson's penchant for pragmatism and optimism, however, he conceded that his new countrymen possessed a natural genius and the ability to learn whatever they put their minds to. In other words, there was hope for the inhabitants. Territory Governor William Claiborne's early assessment of Louisiana education and Louisiana leadership was not as charitable as even Jefferson's tempered remarks. Claiborne's 1804 views were interesting and would be restated in different contexts at different times for the next 2 centuries. In a letter to United States Secretary of State James Madison, the merchants as well as the planters in this country appear to be wealthy. Their habits of living are luxurious and expensive, but by far the greater part of the people are deplorably uninformed. The wretched policy of the late government having discouraged the education of the youth, the attainments of some of the people consist only of a few exterior accomplishments. Frivolous diversions seem to be among their primary pleasures, and the display of wealth and the parade of power constitute their highest objects of admiration. Despite those views, or maybe because of them, education was an important policy issue during Claiborne's tenure as governor. He saw in Louisiana the possibility of instituting a rather ambitious plan for public education. Claiborne pursued several strategies and initiatives. He lobbied the Jefferson administration for federal funds, land grants for education, and the use of federal buildings for schools. He worked to gain support of Louisiana leaders and citizens for education, and he led the process to win legislative support for educational funding. Claiborne envisioned his public school system as a key agent in the Americanization of the polyglot population of Louisiana. He wanted the schools to enroll, quote, the children of native Louisianians and the Native Americans, of the native Frenchmen and the native Spaniards, end quote, and to encourage some early association and friendship that might induce the rising generation to consider themselves one people. Claiborne may have been one of the first American officials to articulate this assimilative ideal, an ideal that would later resonate throughout America in the 19th and 20th centuries. Imposed the American institution on Louisiana citizens, Claiborne soon learned, was no simple undertaking. The Creoles, as Louisiana's French-speaking natives were called, had their own ideas about the future of their society and the kind of education it required. The way they saw it, they were not immigrants coming into some new society in need of Americanization. From their point of view, the Americans were the newcomers who should adapt to their established culture. The Creoles set themselves to defend their society against the newcomers. In his efforts to persuade members of the legislature to support his education plans, Claiborne wisely chose not to lecture them on their frivolous diversions. Rather, he appealed to their pride in a competitive civic spirit that he hoped existed. In his December 1804 message to the council, he pointed out that other states were making encouraging progress in education that, in his estimation, was comparable to developments in Europe. Claiborne also cautioned them that parsimonious plans will seldom succeed. He urged them to design and support a well-funded, comprehensive education system. That following spring, the Legislative Council approved a bill to create a system of public education in Louisiana. Though short on funding, the plan was as ambitious as Claiborne had urged. The bill authorized the creation of a state-supported system of secondary and higher education controlled by a 24-member Board of Regents. In bare outline, the bill authorized the College of New Orleans, a male academy in each parish, a public library in each parish, and discretion to the regents in where and how many female academies to establish. The philosophical support for female academies around the state placed Louisiana in the forefront of progressive female educators. That progressive spirit was not evident when it came time to finance the system. Claiborne had council annual state appropriations to fund the system. Council members eschewed that idea, opted instead to use proceeds from a proposed lottery to support the schools. Even that flawed idea was made worse by the terms of the arrangement for using lottery proceeds. First, the tickets were expensive, $10 each. Second, lottery officials had to sell 8,000 of the 10,000 available tickets before they could hold a drawing. And without a drawing, the Board of Regents could not access any of the funds to start the school system. A frustrated Claiborne would lament in a letter to Thomas Jefferson that I fear that cooperation would not readily be obtained.
Excellent.
Stymied in his attempts to establish a system of secondary and public education, Claiborne turned his focus to elementary schools. Again, the legislature responded with a favorable bill. In May 1806, that body passed a bill to establish free public elementary schools throughout the state. The bill placed control and responsibility for funding at the local level, specifically in the hands of a 5-member local school commission. This was a legislative mandate, but a mandate that most local governments ignored. 2 years later, the legislature repealed the 1806 Act and replaced it with a similar one except for an important provision. The new act authorized the assessment of tuition. The 1808 Act experienced no more success than the one that had preceded it. By 1811, only 3 public schools operated in the state. Even as staunch a proponent of public education as Claiborne had started to doubt that sufficient support for education existed in Louisiana. "I'm sorry to observe," Claiborne confessed in a letter to Secretary of the Treasury, "the education of the youth of this district has been and still is greatly neglected. Nor do I expect to see as liberal an appropriation for public schools as the present state of society demands." In 1811, using a surplus in the Treasury, the Louisiana legislature finally appropriated funds to start the secondary and higher education system outlined in the 1805 Education Act. $15,000 went to establish the College of Orleans and $2,000 each to 12 academies. In addition, the legislation provided for an annual appropriation of $3,000 to the College of Orleans and $500 each to the academies. The College of Orleans could and did charge tuition, as did, by all available evidence, the academies, which operated as private schools. In return for state support, the institutions agreed to admit a certain number of indigent students. In the case of the College of Orleans, 50. Some scholars refer to this era as the beneficiary period. because public money went to private schools that agreed to exempt some students from the payment of tuition. Statehood and a new constitution in 1812 did not produce a change in educational philosophy in Louisiana. Indeed, the 1812 Constitution did not mention education, and without vigorous and consistent state leadership, the quest for public education remained for more than 3 decades after statehood, in the words of a current education scholar, a troubled crusade. The real movement to a public school system in Louisiana did not begin until passage of an 1841 bill authorizing the creation of public schools in New Orleans and the adoption of the 1845 state constitution. And even that start in the 1840s had produced little or meager educational gains by 1861. It would be hard to find an education system anywhere in the Western world which faced a level of turmoil and travail comparable to that of Louisiana. That the early leaders' original ideas came down to the present era flawed and unfulfilled should not be surprising. It is more amazing that the public schools have survived at all and that they have often prospered.